turn this up, Charles. You gotta turn this up in my headphones.
Turn it up in the headphones. Just for you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We always appreciate the listen. So, thank you for being here.
That we do.
Yes.
I am very appreciative.
Very appreciative. Today is a very exciting day. We have finished reading Book 2 of the Mistborn series, Wells of Ascension, by Brandon Sanderson. This is our buddy read.
Yeah, our buddy read continues with Well of Ascension.
Yes.
By Brandon Sanderson.
Well said. Well stated. Man, this is exciting. We only have one more book left to go, and then we finish our first trilogy of the show.
That will be a momentous occasion, my good buddy Charles.
It will be a big milestone with my good buddy Dylan. So, should we just jump right into it?
We could. I think you should give them the big news from this last weekend.
What's the big news?
Charles, don't be modest.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Don't you want to tell them about Catan?
Oh, have we ever told them about Catan?
No, but something very important happened this last weekend.
Oh, well, for those of you that don't know, Dylan and I are friends, and as part of our friendship, we meet outside of the podcast to have fun together. And one of those things we do is we play Catan virtually on the internet with another friend of ours, another good friend of ours.
Shout out to Derek.
Shout out to you, Derek boy. So the three of us play Catan. How many games have we played in the past 3 months? Like 10. 11, 10. And I won my first game on Saturday. It was a big deal for me.
It was huge.
It was huge. It was long overdue, honestly. I've come close many times, but this time it just all came together. Luck of the cards, man. Very excited. I had a really strong setup. My opponent Derek had both largest army and longest road. He was 1 point away from winning for many turns.
Tell him about the brick port, Charles.
Oh, the brick port. You guys wouldn't believe this brick port setup I was running. I had a city and a settlement on 2 different brick tiles. So I had the potential to collect a lot of brick, and I was settled on the brick port. Man, I was cashing it in. They couldn't stop me. They were trying to move the robber. You move it to one, I still got the other. No big deal. They move it around, they can't stop me. They tried their best. But in the end, I brought it home. Very excited.
That you did.
And now I think we're ready to stop playing Catan, and we can move on to another game.
Well, for those doing the math at home, there are 3 of us. Me, Charles, and our buddy Derek. We like to call ourselves the M Crew. All of our last names start with M.
It's true.
And, one person wins each game, and we've played 10 games, and Charles won his first game. So, statistically, not great from Charles, but he's on a 1-game winning streak.
We haven't played enough games for a really proper statistical analysis. 10 games is just not enough.
Need to get to maybe 300. Then we'll see.
You're the one doing actual studies. You should know what we need for a sample size.
10 would not do. That's fair.
Yeah. So you know what? I would withhold any kind of judgment. I won the most recent game, and we may move on to something else. Maybe a nice cooperative game for a change.
That would be nice, especially after the huge arguments that you and Derek have been getting in
Things
after
got
recent
heated,
games.
although I still stand by my defense. And you know what? The proof was in the pudding at the end of the day. So
The proof wasn't in the pudding. You got into a fight over the first game, which I won, and Derek was telling you that the way you played was wrong. That's what the fight was
well,
about.
he was
So,
playing way worse than me, so I don't know what his problem was.
all right. Well, I think something co-op could be good for the future. So that's our big news update at the
Yes.
top of the show.
Congratulations
Charles
to
with
me.
the big win.
Yes, the big win, long overdue. I mean, there was another one that I was gonna win and rolled the 7, and then I had to give up half my cards. It was a disaster. Any other dice roll, I would have won. So that one kind of counts. But
And for those of you who have never played Catan, you're welcome for this. What was it, like 5,
yeah,
6
that would be a
minutes
unique
that we've
overlap for
talked
someone
about
listening to a
Catan?
fantasy podcast, like a deep cut fantasy podcast, and also have not played Catan.
Yeah, there's probably a substantial amount of overlap there, so I don't feel too bad.
If you're someone who is listening to our Mistborn Book 2 Wells of Ascension podcast and has not played Catan, reach out to us. We'd be interested to know if you exist.
Or if you're anyone listening to our podcast, please reach out to us.
Yes.
Where can they do that again, Charles?
Where can they do that and where can't they do it? I mean, we're everywhere. We're Facebook, we're Instagram, we're Twitter, FTF Podcast. Unless Twitter, then it's FTF Podcast 1. Don't ask.
Yeah.
And
FTFpodcast at gmail.com. Oh, sorry, the FTFpodcast at gmail.com.
That's
My mistake.
THEFTF Podcast at gmail.com.
Shoot us an email, please.
Let us know you're out there. I have a firm belief no one's going to be out there for a very long time.
I have a little more faith. I know you're out there.
I do believe in you. I hope for you. And speaking of hope, by the way.
Oh, that's a beautiful seg right there, Charles.
Speaking of hope, let's talk about this book. Who's going to read the intro, you or me?
You got it, Charles.
You got it? All right. We prepared an intro this time. Last time was a little shoot off the cuff. This time we prepared just for you. So right now we're reading, this is our buddy read of Mistborn Book 2, Wells of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson. So this is the second of 3 books. If you're listening to this, you've already read Book 2, we're hoping. We're going to pretty much get into the spoilers.
And you've already listened to our first episode, Buddy Read number 1.
Yes.
The Final Empire. Mistborn, The Final Empire,
yes,
of course.
Also by Brandon Sanderson. So be sure to go listen to that. We have a lot that we're going to reference from that episode. And let's just get right into it. So, Wells of Ascension. Here's a little intro for you. In the wake of the Lord Ruler's death, Luthadel is in turmoil. Elend is king now, and the thieving crews are his advisors. 3 hostile armies besiege Luthadel, one of which is led by Elend's father and his bastard, Insane, maybe? Mistborn's son, Zane. Meanwhile, someone in the inner circle is a Khandra spy, which Vin and her own Khandra seek to identify. The mists have started coming out in the day and killing a small number of people. Vin, Sazed, and Tindwell, a female keeper, search through writings by Quan, the Terraceman prophet who proclaimed the original hero of ages, to try and find out why the mists are killing people and how to stop it.
Nailed it.
Thank you.
And for real that time.
I know we had written this one for Elend's father and his bastard (parentheses insane question mark Mistborn son Zane). So I had to take a few liberties with how to read that, but I think it was good.
Yeah.
Because
awesome.
Is he insane? We'll get into it. One other thing I wanted to note before we get into the real discussion is I was reading through Sanderson's prolific annotations on his book. And right at the top, he says, when he's describing why he wrote this book, everyone has read the stories of the heroes overthrowing a tyrant. What I don't think many people have read is the story of those same heroes trying to build and rule a kingdom following their great victory. So that's basically the influence, the idea that was the seed that grew into this book. So Just thought I would
That's an
include that.
awesome grab there, Charles. I hadn't heard that one, but it makes total sense. You
Yes,
think
because
of all these, there's so many books and movies and whatnot that end once the empire or what have you is toppled. I think of Star Wars for
right.
one, right? Or at least the original trilogy ended with the toppling of the empire.
Hmm.
And you don't really get to see what comes after. And in Star Wars' case, they just reset everything and pick up later on,
Right. They
which
don't
is
even know what
annoying.
happened.
But yeah, here you get to see something pretty unique in regard to okay, what happens after a rebellion is successful?
Right. That's one of the things that's interesting about just a lot of modern fantasies trying to explore these ideas beyond just good and evil and good defeating evil. It's like, okay, well, we know that story. In some cases, we've read that story 100 times, but what happens afterwards? And in some cases, actually trying to build and rule afterwards can be more difficult than actually toppling the empire in the first place. And that's kind of the one of the main like directions this book goes in is that idea of what do we do now? How do we move forward? This is more difficult than we thought. There's a lot of consequences we have to now deal with as a result of our overthrowing of the Lord Ruler.
It's interesting that you bring this up, Charles. It actually makes me think about how much of media ends with a relationship starting. So maybe the end of a Disney movie,
Mm-hmm.
typically the two love interests get together, but we don't actually get to, they presumably live happily ever after, but we don't get to see the relationship continue. And I think that's another thing that we get to see in this book is Vin and Ellen end up together at the end of the final empire, and then we actually get to see, okay, well, what happens after that moment where Vin decides to trust again, or trust for the first time, really, and those two presumably get together and live happily ever after? Question mark.
Yeah, and not to bring up Star Wars again, especially the newer movies, but it's like Han Solo and Leia. They end up together at the end of their original trilogy, and in the sequels, they are divorced. So it's just like, oh man, there's a little more complication in there. It's not necessarily happily ever after now, is it? And this book is a lot about kind of the fallout of these moments, specifically around this idea. And Dylan and I have discussed kind of what this book is about in depth in preparation for this episode. And the main focus of our conversations today are going to be this idea of identity and the just how each character is dealing with their identity. And now that the Lord Ruler is toppled and everyone's trying to rebuild, it's like, well, now that we've done the impossible, we've defeated the God King Lord Ruler, what who are we? What are we doing here? Like, how do we move forwards from this? And everyone kind of goes through this really character driven story. This book is particularly about character over plot, I would say.
I'd agree with you there. And I think a big piece regarding that identity is how identity plays itself out in our relationships with others, especially but not exclusively romantic relationships in this book.
Mm-hmm. So should we go ahead and kick it off with one of our main characters in this story is Ellen Venture. As
Yeah.
we mentioned in the intro, Ellen is king now, and the thieving crew are his advisors. We've watched this little bookworm, still kind of a child, turn into someone with the responsibility of a king, and he's trying to grow into that role, and it's proving to be very difficult for him at the beginning of the book. And he's having a very hard time commanding respect while also sticking true to his honesty. One of the quotes that sticks to me is somewhere in the middle of the book. I think he's talking to Tindwyl, and he said, "Can you not be both a man who follows his conscience and a good king?" So he's having a hard time believing in his new kingdom where he's giving the Ska rights and he's having them live amongst with the noblemen. He's building an assembly that has just as much of power as himself as king. He's really trying to give power to the people, and he's experienced a lot of fallout from that. And so he's trying to figure out, man, this would be so much easier if I was a tyrant like the Lord Ruler and kind of enforced my will on people so I can take control and cause progress. But that goes against the whole reason I went into politics in the first place, was to give power to the people.
Yeah, I think you summarized that really well there, Charles. I thought of it as so much of it is about Elend trying to figure out how he can stand by his values while at the same time doing the things that one has to do if they're going to be able to stay in power. We get to see Elend in this book actually lose power, at least temporarily, where he, by his own system that he created, because he's such an idealist, he creates a system that can relatively easily vote him out in his new position, and he actually has to face that pretty soon into his reign.
Right. The irony was that he was deposed by the laws that he wrote. And I think there were two reactions to that. A lot of the characters were like, wow, you're really stupid for doing that. And other characters were like, good for you for being an idealist. You had to stick to your virtues. I think one of the things that Elend had to, and that all these characters are going through, and when we talk about other characters like Sazed and Vin, they make these promises to themselves, and it's promises of what their virtues are. In Elend's case, he's promised himself to be honest, and he can't compromise on that. So when he eventually does develop more into a king, he figures out how to stay true to himself and keep his honesty and his promises, while also taking a more commanding presence as an emperor and a king. So that was a really interesting character development for Elend. Certainly his whole identity is all caught up in this idea of, am I worthy of being king? How can I be king if I'm trying to stay honest and want to give power to people? And that's just his trajectory. One of the relationships that I wanted to talk about with Elend, before we get too far into it, is actually his relationship with Kelsier in this book. He mentions Kelsier a couple times, and every time it's always about how he couldn't never live up to Kelsier. Like, even after Kelsier's dead and gone, everyone likes Kelsier more than him, and he's always been trying to play. He's basically playing second fiddle to Kelsier. So he said, basically, one of these quotes here, there was no one mold for kingship. He would not be like the kings of the past any more than he would be like Kelsier, which, throughout, he drops lines throughout the whole book being like, Kelsier wouldn't have had this problem. Kelsier would have just gone and solved the problem. He would have made it more direct, made it right, made everyone happy. And meanwhile, it seems like everyone hates Elend. So this connection with Kelsier, I think, is a really interesting one, as Elend struggles with his own identity.
Charles, that is such a great point. And I love how Kelsier just looms large over this book. He's my favorite character in the first book. And he has set this precedent for what the leader of this crew is supposed to be like. And I think Elend, for a long time in the book, feels he has to be Kelsier in some way, and he just sees everyone look at him with these looks of, why aren't you Kelsier? He even thinks there's some of that coming from Vin. And
he's not an Allomancer, and like his girlfriend is way more powerful than him, and so he's dealing with that as well.
So much of it. And I think that where he finally gets to with all of this is awesome, because he carves out this space where it's fine that he'll never be Kelsier. There are a lot of things that Kelsier couldn't do that Elend can do, or is better equipped to do. And Elend, he'll never be the charismatic, roguish, if you listen to our last episode,
right,
type figure that Kelsier was. And Kelsier was the man that they needed to topple a god king. But really where they come to in this book was Kelsier is never going to be the man to rule over a kingdom and deal with the day-to-day of that. He would have gone out and done some really, really risky things, I think,
right,
that could have got him into trouble, especially when they ran out of adium, and Kelsier would not have been able to take on Zane using adium in all likelihood. He probably would have tried to. He probably would have got himself killed. And I think Elend comes into his own in this book by accepting that he'll never be Kelsier, and that's a good thing.
Right. I mean, I think Sanderson made such a great move by killing Kelsier in the first book and then having him loom over in the second book. Kelsier's personality, he overshadowed everything and everyone when he was alive. Elend could have never developed as a character, and as long as Kelsier was there, because he's such a dominating presence, Kelsier was basically a character at the end of his arc in book 1, while everyone else really didn't get their chance to shine until this book. So by killing him off at the end, because like you said, he had nowhere to go. He had no business ruling over everybody after toppling the Lord Ruler. That was the point of his end, when he realized that he needed to be the hope for everyone else by sacrificing himself. That was his character coming to the end of his arc. And now we have characters like Elend who are stepping out. They're just beginning, and it's so much more interesting if the rest of the thieving crew and Elend have to do things without him. There's just so much more interesting stuff that can happen. I don't think this book could have been written the same way if Kelsier was still alive. So I think that was a really interesting and really genius creative decision by Sanderson and his treatment of Kelsier in book 2.
Well stated, Charles. I think when we get to Vin, who we'll talk about later, I think we'll discuss her relationship with Elend, so I think we'll get there with him. I do want to mention a couple of quotes I pulled that are from Tindwyl, actually, that she says to Elend, and they're not super... they hint at a little bit some of this identity and relationship stuff, but I'll say I just pulled them because I think they're awesome lines, and Tindwyl really wrecks him at points. At one point she says, "You have proven that you cannot be trusted in the area of personal grooming." Could you imagine if someone just dropped that line on you?
Ooh, she really did tear him down. Tindwyl was interesting. Like, Sanderson made attempts to show that she had other sides to her character, and she was only particularly strict around Elend because she knew that he needed to be stripped down to the foundation, which created some of the better scenes in the beginning of the book.
Yeah, I really like Tindwyl as a character. I wish she lasted longer, honestly. She has another line. She says, "You are still a fool, Elend Venture. You just don't look like one anymore." And she's got a few more like this, but those are the two that stuck out to me as just like savage.
Yeah, she's pretty brutal to poor Elend, but he needed it.
Yeah, and I like that about her. I've known people who played some mentorship roles in my own life who had this kind of approach where they had a good sense for giving someone what they know they need and not just applying that same mentorship strategy across everyone. And it's super effective, and I think Sanderson illustrates that really well here.
Right, and he goes out of his way to have other scenes with Tindwyl where she's a little more forgiving, a little less harsh.
Yeah.
Like with her and Vin, they go dress shopping. That was a nice little B plot line, the dress shopping.
I liked that.
With the girls. I liked it too. It was one of the more different things that happened in the book. There's a lot of back and forth between the same set pieces, and then finally we're doing something different. That moment existed purely to develop the character of Tindwyl mostly, and then what's her name?
Rian.
Chet's daughter, Rian. That's how you pronounce it.
Alrian.
Alrian, yes. Alrian.
Alrian, I think you got there.
Okay. Yeah, so it was to remind everyone that she existed and get Vin back in dresses, but we're going to talk about Vin's identity issues and her dress issues later on, very soon.
Great
actually.
tease.
But yeah, something to look forward to in this episode.
Two men talking about dresses.
That's right.
Because if anyone's going to do a good job of talking about femininity and dresses, it's you and me, Charles.
Not only are we talking about femininity and dresses, we're talking about them as written by a fellow white man.
Yeah. So you know this is going to be a really productive conversation on femininity.
You know this is going to be insightful, so get a pen and paper, get ready to take notes.
Yeah.
The only other quote that I pulled that revolves around Elend and is a Tindwyl quote, because I was kind of pulling quotes that were more around trust, because I thought that was going to play a bigger role than it did in the first book. But they go, "What do you think it makes a man a good king?" Tindwyl of Terrace. And then she says, "Trust. A good king is one who is trusted by his people and one who deserves trust." And I think Elend never thought he deserved it until he joined the Church of the Survivor, which I thought was a nice metaphor of him kind of accepting Kelsier, that he would never be Kelsier, and also his kind of getting more involved with the ska. I thought that was a unique aspect, and he's kind of earning people's trust, and he's turning himself into a person that feels like he deserves it. I think that was his biggest challenge, so that's why I pulled that quote.
Yeah, I think that's a great one. I think that him joining the Church of the Survivor also indicates that he's willing to do things when they're politically pragmatic, and even if they move a little bit away from what his actual beliefs are, because it's not that he actually believes in what the Church of the Survivor folks believe in, but he's thinking, I actually need them as political allies. So yeah, I'm happy to go do that. And once I do it, I will stand by my commitment, because that's important to me, but I don't actually have to stand rigidly by all my actual beliefs, which takes him a little bit away from this rigid scholar and toward a person
and that's why
who
I
makes
think
the
it's
right
important
moves.
when we're talking about these characters struggling with identity, is what promises do they make to themselves, and then when they truly have achieved their character development, it's when they stick to those promises. And then one of Elend's many examples of sticking to his promises is joining the Church of Survivor. He gets deposed. The church has no strategic value anymore. He could have easily just been like, nah, I'm good. But he still continued to play a role in it and fulfill his promise. And I think that's served on two levels. There's the political level, and there's his character staying true to himself and his promises. And then there's also that acceptance element of it because of Kelsier's shadow in the beginning of Book 2. And then by the time he joins the Church of the Survivor, he's not so heavily worried about living up to Kelsier. So I thought that was a nice little moment.
I agree. Well, we went longer on Elend than I would have guessed, but
he was like the
we
main
had some
character
good
of
stuff
this
there.
book. The next character we can go through relatively quickly. Wait, you don't think Elend's the main character of this book?
I think Vin is still the main character.
Vin's still
Let's
the
not
main
get
character, but Elend's the one going through the most development, I would say. Like, Vin goes through some, but it's like...
I think it's fair to say that Elend had the most character development in this book, but Vin's still the main character. That's the way I see it anyway.
Right, fine. I mean, in a book about character development, Elend's the character that went through the most character development So I don't know.
Fair. I'm not gonna
But I mean, you can't say Vin's
I'm not
not
gonna
a main
argue
character.
with you
It is
about.
Mistborn, and so obviously Vin's a main character. Elend is way up there, on par with Vin's character in terms of stuff that's happening in this book.
Well, I agree.
But
Shall we
a character
move to
that's debatably
Sazed?
not the main character is Sazed. Sazed's struggle with identity is a little more obvious, especially towards the end. He struggles with faith, and in the end of the book, he ultimately loses his faith after the Koloss attacks.
Mm-hmm.
But it was kind of hinted at right at his first chapter in the beginning of the book, because here he toppled the Lord Ruler. His whole job as keeper was to remember all these religions so that one day when the Lord Ruler was gone, he could go out and teach everybody all that he knows, and all the other keepers could use all of their knowledge to educate society. And his first chapter, his supposed glorious return of the keepers, ended up being pretty underwhelming. No one cared about anything he had to teach them. Like, everyone kind of begrudgingly learned the lessons that he had, and certainly no one had any kind of faith except maybe the Church of the Survivor, but that's only because they all saw Kelsier and they killed the Lord Ruler. So no one really cared about all these other religions. So you have Sazed, whose one job was to teach people, and no one wanted to learn. And then you go on to have these Koloss attacks where he watched people just get brutally murdered by vicious creatures, and he loses faith, which is an interesting build-up to his redemption in Book 3. But no spoilers for Book 3, but it is kind of a fun little setup for his... Knowing how Book 3 ends, it's interesting how Sanderson's plotting is moving on throughout the trilogy with Sazed. But
Well, the loss of Tindwyl for Sazed, when they're clearly falling in love or something along those lines.
I think that's fair to say.
It was, yeah. So the loss of Tindwyl was huge for shaking his faith. I think he'd cared a lot about people before, but he'd never truly been in love before, from what we can gather. And so that was a big one. And I think what, at least my first time reading this book, went a little... I didn't notice as much, was how he's finally basically able to convert clubs to a religion. He finds one that works, so clubs is obviously a super grumpy
even clubs gets
dude.
his little bit of character development. It's like 2
He
seconds.
gets a lot, a surprising amount in this book, actually,
Considering
he
his
had
screen time,
almost no lines, in the first one. And so he ends up converting to this because we see on his dead body is this, I think, like wooden chip that Sazed gave him.
Yeah, he was wearing it as a necklace, and then he may have been like clutching it or something. I can't remember, but he was definitely wearing it.
Yeah, so he dies, and then I think part of what's going through Sazed's head where he's losing faith is this idea that he converted this guy he cares about, and then the guy just promptly dies. It just didn't help him at all. So seeing that, and also seeing all these people who are in the Church of the Survivor who thought that Kelsier would come save them or something like that, also die in front of him,
Right.
I think just had him thinking, okay, what is any of this actually doing for people?
Right. And on top of all of that, the way this book ends, he finds out that it's not the deepness. It's called what's the big bad in this? It's not the
Ruin, but I don't think it's said in this book.
This book ends with him realizing that someone's been changing history.
Yes.
For hundreds of years.
Oh, that's so true.
And so he's like, everything I learned was a trick in the first place. None of it was even true. It was this elaborate ruse by the deepness, Ruin, to make us free him eventually. It was this long con to get the Wells of Ascension, the power in the Wells of Ascension released into the world. So he's beyond shaken by the end of book 2. It's like even all the stuff I fought so hard to remember in my metal minds has been corrupted, and the foundation on everything that we believed has been corrupted. So what is even the point anymore?
Charles, that's a great point. I would have felt bad if we overlooked this one.
I got you.
Because that's the terrorist religion that had those prophecies. So that's Sazed's people's religion.
And let's not forget the Lord Ruler was Terrace also, and he murdered, he tried to commit genocide of his whole religion.
That doesn't help. And I think the fact that the thing that would be closest to his religion, and the thing he probably held up most as trying to discover stuff about, was the terrorist religion, and finding out that was just built on all these lies from some sort of entity that is manipulating them is just a huge fatal blow. Maybe not fatal, a huge blow to Sazed's faith, and we'll see him ruminate about that for probably 500 pages in the next book.
But it's all part of his glorious arc, which we won't get into. But the only other thing that I noted about Sazed that I thought was super interesting, and this is part of Sanderson's beautiful way he likes to have opposites work together, because Sazed has always been even self-described as a rebel in book 1, maybe more than book 2, where he never kind of fit in with the rest of the Terracemen, and they dedicate a lot of time between Sazed and Tinswell to talk about how much of a rebel Sazed has been, and yet he was the one that got the most results, and they were kind of debating back and forth. It's like, is he a good Terraceman or not? Like, he went against the order at all times. He went against his nature as a Terraceman to join this thieving crew, but in the end, he's the one who helped play a huge part in overthrowing the Lord Ruler, and he's now leading the way in research on the Wells of Ascension. And to me, what makes this character so interesting, and what makes a lot of Sanderson characters so interesting, is because it's nice when you can make a character feel real turmoil for doing the right thing. Sazed always believed he was doing the right thing, but he also felt really bad about it, which is brilliant. The same way that Vin did the right thing at the Wells of Ascension.
Yes.
But she ended up feeling very bad for it. So this whole...
And Elend does the right thing many times as king, and then feels bad because it gets him in a position where he can't make decisions for his people anymore because he gets deposed. I mean, that's true. All over the place in this book.
It's really a really interesting, more higher level concept of being like, I'm doing the right thing all the time, but it's not. It's just really tough. It's not easy to do, and it's I'm in turmoil, just existing with myself, trying to do the right thing. Who would have thought doing the right thing would be so difficult?
And I think that's something that people face all the time in real life. I think most people are trying to do the right thing, yet there's so many people that we see out there doing things that we think are really messed up or wrong, and I think a lot of us are dealing with that, right? We're all the heroes of our own stories, and then we still have these moments where we do stuff that's wrong, often unintentionally.
And then we have to live with the consequences, which is what this book really tries to get into. The meat of how do we develop as people facing the consequences of our actions. So the fallout,
such as overthrowing the Lord Ruler.
That's right.
Well, I feel good about what we got out there about Sazed. I think there'll be a lot more of Sazed discussion in our next buddy read. So
I think that's fair.
Shall we go on to talking about Vin and also her relationship with Zane?
Kick it off, buddy.
Well, I think that this is a big part of the book. So Vin is obviously in something of a relationship with Ellen, although I don't think she's quite ready to put a label on it. And Sanderson, maybe being a Mormon, doesn't know that anything comes between, like, we're interested in each other and marriage, so she doesn't want to get married to him. Not Sanderson, I mean Ellen. And Vin. Vin is pretty much going back and forth throughout this book between these two sides of herself that she sees as, in classic Sanderson fashion, being completely opposed to each other. So there's what she sees as the Vin side of herself, which is the thief that grew up on the streets. And then there's the Valette side of herself.
Mm.
Valette, you'll remember from the first book, is the guise that she wore when she was in the balls and whatnot, pretending to be a noblewoman. So Vin likes dresses and all this kind of stuff, and at the same time, she's an absolute killing machine. And she has a hard time reconciling these two parts of her. And I think that what's exemplifying this in the book more than anything is how she ends up torn between Ellen and her sort of love triangle, love interest, Zane, who's actually Ellen's father's bastard son, so I guess half brother. And she ends up really having a hard time deciding between the two. And I think that Zane represents a side of her that she sees as being violent and being destructive and having difficulty trusting, while Ellen represents this side of her that's more feminine and more, I guess, who she thought she was pretending to be when she was Valette.
That's really interesting. Because you had posed this question to me of the purpose of the Vin Zane relationship when we were doing our planning, and I pretty much said almost exactly what you said. You made some great points. What I always thought that Zane was the kind of the foil for Ellen. Like you said, they're opposites. Ellen is safety, and you mentioned femininity, which I thought is really interesting. And Zane is danger. They share many of the same features. Zane definitely has those features that are twisted, very reminiscent of Vin's upbringing, where she was skittish and on the edge and trusted no one. If that woman came into her own with allomancy and never met Ellen, she may very well have been someone like Zane. So I think she sees that in herself. Zane certainly serves as a temptation, also just a reminder of that dark past and the potential of her abilities. Zane drags her to Chet's stronghold, and they do something very Kelsier-like, where they just go straight for the bad guy and use their powers to just wreck shit. And they get all the way to Chet's throne right in front of them. They kill all the guards in this spectacular feat of violence and mastery of allomancy. And then Vin shows mercy, which is, a comment on how she's different from Zane. And that was a really interesting component to their relationship. The other thing that I thought about when I was thinking about the Vin-Zane relationship and why it existed, for me, when I think of Vin in this book, right, she's in basically a committed relationship with Ellen. And, they're very serious at this point. It's like, why don't we get married kind of conversations. And, we'll hold off, we'll see. So she's also still, she may be turning 20. No, she's not 20 yet. So she's still in her teens.
She's 18.
She's 18 years old. This Ellen is the only boy she's ever been in a relationship with. So she's never really had the opportunity to kind of choose her destiny. She was with Kelsier. Kelsier died. She's with Ellen now. She never really faced the temptation or the choice. She kind of ended up with Ellen. So Sanderson did something really smart in this book where he created the character of Zane, a Mistborn with who's like Ellen. However, he's kind of got a lot of Kelsier in him too, but like the edgy side of Kelsier, the dark side of Kelsier, and that's the option that Zane represents. Because in a way, there was a lot Vin admired about Kelsier. I'm not saying that they were romantic in any way, but certainly she would find those qualities romantic in another person. So, which is why she kind of falls for Zane for a while. It's this, Kelsier had this magnetism about him, and then since he died, Vin didn't even get to decide who she was going to be. Kelsier had died, and so now enter Zane, who's this edgy edgelord, mentally ill master allomancer guy, and all of a sudden she's like, "Is this the part of me that I'm supposed to embrace? Are my powers something that will keep me from ever relating to Ellen in any way? Am I really Zane?" And I think her struggle with that is a huge part of her character development in this book. And we all know this book's all about character development.
Yeah. So I think you did a great job of laying that out there. And I think that our next question, now that we understand what the purpose of Zane in this book is how successful of a device was Zane, and how successful would you say him and his relationship with Vin achieved that purpose for Sanderson as a writer?
That's a good question. I would say it was successful. I think Zane poses some good questions. He's like, tell me, do they understand you, Vin? Can they understand you? And can a man love something he doesn't understand? Like, he's very clear on this, like, it's you and me are the only two that knows what this is like. No one else understands us. And can they even love us if they can't understand us? And I think what Sanderson was trying to work his way towards is she chooses Ellen because of his ability to trust. And it's like, he doesn't need to understand everything about me. We don't need to be the same. We can be opposites, but the success in this relationship is that he trusts me to do the right thing. And so in that way, I would say it's a success. My only kind of qualm about the whole thing is that Zane himself is not a likable guy. Like, he's so obviously the wrong choice.
Exactly.
And he's so obviously this edgelord of a guy. It's like, we know Vin is never going to choose him. It's fun to see him as that temptation. It was fun when they went to Chet's stronghold, but it's like, come on, really? What redeeming quality does Zane have that Vin would ever choose him over Ellen? He's not a nice guy. Just because he's also a Mistborn, that was my only issue with the whole thing.
Oh, Charles, you took the words right out of my mouth with that one. Because what I wrote in I was keeping a running notes list as I was reading through this book, and I wrote that no one is Team Zane.
No.
So remember the Twilight books? I never actually read them. So, but one thing that was a phenomenon with those books was that people were picking sides. Team Edward and Team Jacob, I believe, but I didn't look that up beforehand, so I might be okay. And no one is going to read this book and be Team Zane because he's so obviously a bad choice for her.
Right.
And I think that, like you're saying, he's successful in raising a lot of these questions. He's successful in helping Vin grapple with all of these sides of herself. And I think I'll get to a quote toward the end of this segment where I'll kind of say what I think Vin's overall journey is about realizing. But I think that he would have been more successful if we actually buy him as an option.
Yeah. I believe it. I mean, it would be interesting because Vin, I keep forgetting, like, a part of me always goes back to, like, she's an 18-year-old girl. There's like, can we please revisit that? She should have no emotional maturity. The fact that Vin understands people at the level that she does is crazy to me. I'm like, I wish they showed more of an 18-year-old girl in Vin. And I feel like part of an 18-year-old girl is falling for like the bad boy, you know, but Zane is just too over the top. It would have been interesting to have that, ooh, he's that, you know, the guy with the leather jacket and the motorcycle pulling up. You know, it's like, ooh, there's something kind of dangerous but interesting about this guy. But no, he's like full on like, I cut myself and I kill all these people and I don't care about anyone and I'm a total psycho. So, I mean, it's a little too far.
Well, and we should probably also mention that as former 18-year-old boys ourselves, we don't think that there's a lot of emotional maturity going on for 18-year-old boys either.
Definitely not for
But
us anyway.
yes, very true. And having known each other as 18-year-old boys, we can definitely say that. And I'll say too, the Zane stuff, I think that where we go wrong to some extent here is that so Sanderson has noted that he plots out, he outlines his plot really strongly, and then he does what's called discovery writing his characters. So that means as he's going through this plot, he's trying to make the characters what they need to be to fit with it, and works really, really well in a lot of places. I think Zane is an example where it goes a little bit wrong. And I think that what happens there is Sanderson needs Zane to fulfill both the role of Vin's love interest who's tempting her away from Ellen, and as part of his plot, also wants Zane to fulfill the role of showing us that you can hear voices when you have a metal spike inside of you.
Right.
And so he establishes that really well. And
it was a great twist. The idea was like when we discover as the reader that he has a nail in his spike in his back, and then he goes on to the voice and the tone of the voice in his head changes as he's dying. Like those were very interesting moments.
Very well done. And I think he does a better job at fulfilling that than maybe he does of the love interest. And so we get that line that's along the lines of "You were never crazy." In the mental health field, which I'm in, we wouldn't use that word.
As a PhD candidate in psychology.
Yes. Yeah. So obviously he's dealing with a lot of mental health difficulties here. We call what it looks like he has psychosis. But it turns out he actually doesn't have psychosis. There's just some voice talking to him somehow. I think I'm probably spoiling a little bit of book 3, but I'll say that is being established, and that's making him so, let's say, unstable that we just don't buy him as a good option for Vin. We don't want her with someone who's that unstable and violent. And I know that there's this stuff where it's like, oh, he reminds her of Kelsier. I think she even says it explicitly at one point. And I'll say he's got some of those elements. As you're saying, the edge lord side of it is just turned up to 11. And because of that, he doesn't remind me that much of Kelsier. And I have to imagine that a lot of readers were not reminded that much of Kelsier. Honestly, if he was a younger version of Kelsier, I thought they did a great job in the first book of making Kelsier more of a mentor and even fatherly figure. At one point, I think he puts his arm around her or something, and in the first book, and Sanderson says like he put a fatherly arm around her, and I actually really appreciated that adverb there because I was like, this scene could have gotten very different. So I thought they did a great job with that, but I think, a younger Kelsier, if Zane could actually be that, which I think he could have if Sanderson wasn't trying to establish a bit about what happens if you have a Mel Spike in you, then I think we would have had a much better love triangle there, and it would have been really interesting. There would have been people who were Team Zane.
Right? I love how you tapped into Sanderson's writing style. It's such an interesting perspective that I didn't even consider. That's why we do the buddy reads. to expose ourselves to these new ideas. That's so true. I do think that we kind of missed an opportunity for Zane to be a more viable candidate for Vin. Like, he was never in my idea of like, oh my god, she might go off with him. I was just like, there's no
Yeah.
way. Like, give me a break. But
And because we're missing that, and we're in Vin's shoes, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't buy into her temptation as much, and I think that's what's lost, is we have to feel tempted.
Right. And it's still a very successful character arc, and it still has a fun twist. Sanderson always delivers on the twists, but I do think
For sure.
I would be very interested to read the version of this book where Zane is a little more likable, a la Kelsier. Should we just get right into our ending twist reactions? We're sitting at about 15
I think it's time.
All right. I want to start. The first twist I want to talk about is Osir being the mole. That's the one I want to mention first, because this one is super good. The discerning eye could have maybe caught it, and I knew it was coming. I'm trying to remember if I predicted it. I don't think there's any way.
I did not predict it in my first read.
But
I know that for a fact.
I know the moment. Like, I was like, oh, this is the moment. Like, it's clearly has switched. But that's only because I remembered, I was going back knowing what happened. So I found the moment when the switch occurred. And it's so interesting how he builds up this twist. Sanderson's like
it's
a
so
flippin'
well
magician. He hid the mole in plain sight. It's like sleight of hand. He's doing all this stuff right in front of you, and you're like, what the heck? He has such a great idea of sowing seeds of distrust. And, Vin's already someone who's very easy to distrust. So she immediately was like, it could be Ellen. It could be anybody. Yep. And so she was like trying to rule everyone out. And we never once suspected that the Kandra was a Kandra spy playing a Kandra. Is so good. Because in the first book, Vin learned to trust, right? She learned that it's better to trust and be betrayed than to suspect everyone. And what makes this twist so brilliant is that there was no traitor. It was the Kandra. It was so brilliant. Everyone stayed true to Vin and to Kelsier and to the Vision. It's just, and you never see it coming. It's super good in that respect. I love this one.
I remember being extremely invested in figuring out who the Kandra is throughout this book, and I do research in psychology. I'm a really investigative dude, and I was obsessed with this. I was scrutinizing it so much. That's why I remember I didn't figure it out, because I just did not think to go for the actual Kandra.
I think you could give Sanderson a higher compliment, where it's like, I scrutinized this writing trying to figure it out, and you still surprised me, and you still surprised me in a way where I was like, of course.
Yep.
Like, that's the most brilliant
It was beautifully
part.
done.
And
yeah,
for me, it's just that second layer of there being no traitor. It was basically a Kandra replacing a Kandra. I don't know. That's the best twist in the book, probably, for me, is this one here. I just thought it was so good. It takes a real skill to kind of... And then he, takes the heat off of the Kandra by having us follow that one dude, I forget his name, who was in the religion of the... Is
it Lemieux or something like that?
It starts with the letter D, to something.
Demieux?
Demieux,
something like that.
Or something. Vin started following, he was sneaking out, and they started following him, and I'm like, oh, okay. It's like, Sanderson knows how to balance the heat of suspicion around, and it's just all right. And meanwhile, the Kandra was there the entire time, giving you advice, oh, the skeleton's very old, mistress. I'm like, oh, it's not possible. And you're like, okay, well, it's not possible.
Well, that's Sanderson using his understanding of the tools of writing against us, because he puts at that time, Osure?
Oh,
Uh,
sir? Oh,
Osure?
sure? Oh, sure? Oh, sure?
Anyway, he puts him, the Khandra, in the position of authority on this, and we as the reader take to that because we're familiar with it. Oh, okay, there's a Khandra here who's going to help explain
Right.
the things
And
that
he's
we need
always
to
built
know.
up that Khandra take the form of humans as part of the contract, and like it was insulting
Yes.
to take the form of a dog. Like this was the first time this was ever happening.
Yes. And it was just putting that Khandra in the place of authority on this issue. We think as the reader that we are going to learn the things we need to help us solve the problem from this person, so that, or Khandra, dog, and then we take his words the same way Vin does, where we're completely trusting of them. And we view this person as this very trustworthy person, or trustworthy Khandra. And then we just, I mean, if you're anything like me, you completely fell for it, didn't even consider the Khandra in all this.
I know, and it was there the whole time too. On the reread, I was like, "There's the moment. He put it in there." Like it's like when you're watching a magician and you know the trick. It's like, "Oh, I see now that sleight of hand that he
Yeah.
snuck in there. It's so sneaky." Man, it was
Yeah.
really great.
And it's funny because he wraps it up in this, oh, he's learning to trust Vin narrative, where Vin's being nicer. And then there is this moment pretty early on where now Tensoon is coming up to Vin and giving her a vial kind of like without her requesting it, I think it was. Something
Right.
along those lines.
Right.
And she literally thinks, oh, you've never done that before. And we as readers are like, well, that's because he's learning to trust you, Vin. And in reality, it's because he's a different being.
Yeah, it's not the same Khandra. So good. So that was my favorite twist.
Yeah, that's so good. I think that it's probably the most well written twist.
I mean, it's
and
very
the
much an
most subtle
old-fashioned whodunit,
in
and like
yeah.
sometimes you can do these whodunits and it's something that's totally out of left field. It takes real. I think one of the hardest things you could probably do, something I know I could never write, is a good whodunit where the answer is in plain sight and you have to. And it's this great reveal that you're like, of course, why didn't I think of that? It's like that's such a hard reaction to get, especially from a discerning reader scrutinizing everything, trying to figure it out. And you have that confidence to just put him right in the front of everything and just chime in with ideas and provide us with facts. Oh man, it's so good. That's Sanderson's mastery of plotting there that really pays off.
Well done.
He always has
Yeah.
the payoff.
I think of this as the better version. Although I think one of the better twists in the last book is that Sean ends up being a Mistborn. But I think kind of like the same stuff that Sanderson was playing with there, where it's in plain sight. Because look, she's obviously a soother, I think it was.
Right.
And it's like, oh, we're just showing you that Vin has discovered this. But in reality, she's a Mistborn, and there's no reason to think that she wasn't. It's just, oh, we're being told she's a soother, so we're accepting that at face value, while that could be a hint, in theory, that she might be a Mistborn at the very least. And this is an even better version of that great twist.
Oh,
so.
yeah, it was definitely a better version. Because in this version, he was like challenging us. He's like, there is a spy in the ranks.
Yes.
And we're like, okay, who is it going to be? Does he give us enough information? Because I'm like, he doesn't give us enough information. There's still so many people it could be. But then it's like, oh, duh. Damn.
Yeah.
Man,
well, then I think we should also get to the biggest twist, at least from a consequentialist perspective in this book, which is that we get Vin to this point where she's in the Well of Ascension, and we think that what must be an evil Miss Spirit has injured Elend perhaps fatally if Vin doesn't take the powers for herself to heal him. And then it turns out that when Vin gives up the power, the thing that was supposed to be the noble thing to do, sets free some sort of evil entity. And
So good.
there's, yeah, Charles, some reactions to this?
I think it's brilliant. You know, it was like kind of what I said in the CZ arc. I was like, it's always nice when you make a character feel bad for doing the right thing.
Yep.
And it's also just a trope on fantasy at large where it's like this selfless act of like, I'm giving it up. I'm doing the right thing. I've come full circle in my identity. I'm gonna. This is what I'm destined to do. I'm the chosen one. I'm giving it up. And then it was like, I'm free, and he just like flies off, and you're like, oh, what?
That's so good.
It's free, and then it's like, and it's just like, oh, and then Vin is immediately like, oh, I fucked up. It's
Yep.
not good, and then the mist points to that bead that
Yes.
Ellen swallows to become Mistborn to save his life. It's like, oh my god, this mist thing was trying to force me to, because it can't communicate for whatever reason, it's trying to force me to take the power. It's tried so hard to communicate with me that I need to take the power, and I just was so virtuistic that I was ready to let Ellen go to do the right thing, and
I
and
know.
that just messed everything up. Like, so much horrible stuff has now been released onto the world, and that to me is such a brilliant. It works on so many levels. It works on like the character development level. It just fantasy tropes at large. Sanderson's plotting and his ability to write twists. I mean, he's
Yeah.
so
She threw
good.
the ring into Mount Doom. You're supposed to win when you do that.
Yeah. But this time the ring actually ended up being the good thing, and then now the big bad is released.
Yeah.
What a great way to
It's
end this book too.
so good.
Because I feel like the
So,
book was
so
kind
good.
of dragging at a lot of parts. So to get to this part where it ends with you wanting more is really important and brings this book up a whole point in the rating system for me. It's like, wow, the way Sanderson brings it home is unlike any other. He's always satisfying, and he always makes it worth your while to read. He's like, you
He
read
really
Sanderson,
does.
you know you're gonna get a return on your time invested, and this came through in a big way for me. And this ending twist is a huge part of it. His last 15% of his book is just like twist after twist, so good. And I just love this whole concept that everyone was being so on their high horse and so virtuistic and so ready to sacrifice that they ended up releasing evil.
Yeah. It's so well done. I love that the Mist Spirit, who we're so convinced as readers is the evil one, especially after
He tries
it
to kill it.
stabs Ellen, turns out being a good force. I love that in addition to all that you said about the giving it up. And there's just great foreshadowing towards this that manages, it's not as subtle as the reveal of Tensoon, but uh, it is subtle enough where
It's like,
it takes a
someone
lot to
keeps
connect the
ripping,
dots in the
someone
right
keeps
way.
ripping all the pages off of this book, and then in the beginning, it's like, I write this in metal because nothing else can be trusted.
I mean, that's
And
telegraphed, and we still don't figure it out.
right, I mean, you can tell that something's up because it's very obviously stated, and then at the end, right before the rising action, you have Sazed and Tyndall being like, someone is messing with our notes and like trying
Yeah.
to hide stuff. And so you're like, man, something is going down between only metal being true, and because they're not doing anything in metal, obviously they're writing all this stuff down, and it's all this written stuff that's getting affected. So you see the connection, but the big leap is that there's this level of intrigue that's just so deep in this world that
Yeah.
the twist at the end of this book sets a whole different tone for book 3. It's like, wow, what a big what a big fallout that had. Talk about taking over the Lord Ruler. Now it's whatever this pure evil spirit is, and that puts into perspective the Lord Ruler also, which I almost didn't even talk about. the Lord Ruler, who we thought was evil, he's still
Redemption.
evil, but he's got a bit of a redemption in this because
He
he
does.
was the one that did his best he knew the stakes. Like the person who set him forth, his uncle, was the one who wrote all this stuff, and he's like, I remember things differently than what's written. I don't know what is going on. I just know that it can't go on as everyone expects it to. And so he takes Rashik, the Lord Ruler, puts him in charge of making sure that the power is not released. So now he looks like this evil, backstabbing, conniving, sniving beta male dude for just stabbing this guy in the back and taking the power. But he was the only one that knew what was at stake. And he did his best to create a world in his own image, but he ended up messing it up, and like he put the planet too close to the sun, and then had to make ash so that the sun wouldn't kill everybody, and then he had to make people be more sturdy against ash. So he was just like doing his best, but he kept messing up, and then you get what you have in book 1. So it does give you a new opinion of the Lord Ruler of all people.
Well, yeah, I can't remember if this was on or off air, but maybe we talked about it in our first podcast. I mentioned that I think Straff and Sean in the first book are the two most unambiguous, like evil characters.
Right.
I think that continues here. Straff has 0 redeeming qualities.
0.
And
he continues to have 0 in this book.
I think we discussed the Lord Ruler briefly, and I said, well, especially with stuff that's coming up, the Lord Ruler has more redeeming qualities than does maybe even Sean Ilarial. But at the very least,
on the podcast.
More than Straff.
I'm pretty sure that, yeah, he definitely has more redeeming qualities than Straff. Straff you find out he's just worse than you expected.
Terrible.
And so... But you actually find out the Lord Ruler had somewhat good intentions. He was still like a tyrant and enslaved people, and was not a nice dude. But
and what he does to the Terrace people obviously is
genocide is never excusable.
Reprehensible. And at the same time, in a twisted way, which I think is fair to a guy who, in his regular life beforehand, obviously had some jealousies and some hatred. Not a great guy, but probably hero of his own story.
If the deepness was as bad as he knew it to be, he's the only one that knows the truth. So he's I can't let it happen again. I have to, kill everyone in the religion because the deepness is out there trying to trick people, and I just gotta do everything I can to cover it up. I just think he wasn't capable. He was the only one that knew the truth, and he was given the power, but he didn't have the capability. So now he's just trying to he's trying to treat symptoms and making things even worse. It's like, oh man, the planet's bad. Now I have to put ash in it. Oh no, the ash was bad. Now I have to change people. Oh man, the terrorists can't send anyone to the Well of Ascension. I got to kill them all now. Oh man, so he's like trying to change things. He's just making everything worse. But I feel also in a way he was evil enough to be okay with those things in the first place. So
well, I think so too. I think that what he does to the Terrace people is done from a place where what he doesn't want is for someone to also have allomantic powers and feruchemy.
You could argue
then
that he
replace
also
him,
didn't want anyone to learn about the religion and the Well of Ascension and try and take the power.
Yeah, that's for sure part of it.
You could argue that it's...
Well, I think that part of it is that he doesn't want to end up in a place where someone could replace him because, as he indicates at the end of the first book, he thinks that he's the only one with the knowledge of all of this stuff around ruin and all the bad stuff that will benight the world if he is destroyed. So he thinks, hey, if someone actually gets these powers and kills me or replaces me, then they're not going to know what to do.
Right.
And only I can do this. So I think, obviously, awful things that he does. But I think, he's the hero of his own story. He thinks he's doing the right thing.
Right. You can't justify a lot of his actions, but he was coming from a place of Only I really know how to keep this planet all, from total ruin. So, but
No pun intended.
no pun intended, my friends. Well, we're kind of maxed out on time, but there was something I wanted to surprise you with, a little bit of trivia. But
Okay.
to leave everyone home with. I was perusing through Sanderson's annotations of his chapters, which is such a great thing to do. If you really enjoyed the book, to go back and read those things, he gives you the keys into his brain. It's really interesting. But do you remember a scene? Ellen and Vin have dinner with Chet. Chet's in Luthadel. And there's a line Chet says where he says, I've already lied to you 3 times.
Yes.
Do you know what the 3 lies are? Because I know them now.
I remember when I came across that I thought there would be 3 actual lies. Like Sanderson didn't just pull out a number, but
There are 3 lies.
I didn't go back and
I remember reading that line and being
again.
like, you know what? I'll take his word for it. And I kept reading. But I have the 3 lies here, and they're very interesting.
Okay.
The first lie is that he didn't care if Alrienne ran off. That's lie number 1.
That's fair and definitely shown by... I like how her arc ends up, actually. And how she runs toward the army, and then he has to follow her if he's going with his troops.
Right, and she's an interesting character.
To keep her alive.
Like, she plays a role in order to influence people around her. Like, her being an Allomancer and then affecting Breeze was also very interesting. But so that was lie number 1. The second lie is that he wasn't annoyed to find that Breeze was having a relationship with Alrienne.
That's fair. I mean, we spoke a little bit about the kind of creepy age gap between Ellen and Vin, and this makes that look creepier. Totally appropriate because Breeze is, I think, in his mid-30s, and Alrienne is 18.
Oh, yeah, he's more than... I think, he's way, way older. It's very weird. Like, Alrienne is young. But he tries to make it where Alrienne, is into it. But it's still, okay, but how much agency does she have as being 18? But whatever. I guess
it's weird.
In the Final Empire, you just age a lot faster, I suppose.
I think, it's interesting how he plays that with her being the one who is using allomancy to seduce him, but he wasn't using it on her. I guess that's an attempt to equal the power dynamic there, but I think it's a very 2007.
I mean, Breeze does feel guilty about it. He is, has the decency to feel shame. Doesn't stop him.
It was 2007. I think Sanderson wouldn't be writing that in 2020.
Who's to say? It's a different time and place. And now the third lie, and this is very interesting, is that he told 3 lies during the conversation.
Oh.
He actually only told 2, but that made it 3. Which is why he said good luck figuring out what they are. Mm-hmm.
So both of the other lies were about basically that he cares about his daughter, even though he pretends he doesn't.
Right, because she's in the hands of Ellen and Breeze at this moment.
And that ends up being pretty much the most key part of her and Set's relationship to the plot. So I appreciate that those were the 2 other lies. Well done by Brandon Sanderson.
Yep, that's some fun trivia. That's a deep cut written by Sanderson himself. That's the kind of content you can expect from a podcast like this one. What other podcast is talking about Chet's 3 lies in Mistborn Book 2, Wells of Ascension by Brandon Sanderson? How many?
There's probably at least one.
I found 0.
No, there's a podcast that's only about Brandon Sanderson's work, and I think the Cosmere maybe in particular. I wish I remembered the name so I could.
Maybe. Well, I'll have to go back and listen. But we're, less than 5.
Oh, the Shardcast. The Brandon Sanderson podcast.
The Shardcast?
Shard. Oh, come on, man. You're better than that. The Shard cast. And they've been doing it since 2012.
Wow.
They've been at it.
Wow.
5 stars with 132 ratings.
That's pretty good. I'll have to listen.
Go listen to the Shard cast.
Go listen to Shardcast. See if they talk about Chet's lies. Because that's a deep
They probably
cut.
do.
I mean,
how
must.
much
All these
they
years,
got to cover a lot of ground in 8 years of talking only about Brandon Sanderson's books.
I know. They must have covered it. But you know what? Less than 5 podcasts probably have talked about
I think that's probably
Chet's
fair.
lies. So
Might just be
statistics
2.
are good. Might just be 2. So that's the show, everybody. Thank you for listening.
Where can they reach us again, Charles?
Where can they reach us? They can reach us on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF Podcast and on Twitter at the FTF Podcast 1, number 1. There we are also at theftfpodcast.com, and our email is theftfpodcast@gmail.com. So
Nailed it.
be sure to.
I was putting you on the spot to see if you would get all that. You did nail it.
I was there when they were written, as Elrond says in Lord of the Rings. I don't. Oh, no. It's Aslan in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's like, don't cite the deep magic to me. I was there when it was written. That's Aslan.
Yeah.
And so I'm now saying, don't tell me I don't know where we can go in the podcast because I was there. I created it. We created it. Anyway, that was close enough. Guys, thank you so much for listening. We know you have a lot of choices when it comes to choosing podcasts, and we're so glad that you chose ours. We hope you come back. We're going to have, later on in the week, we're going to do our review of the reviews for this book. Remember, we're spinning it off into its own segment, seeing as we've already maxed out our time for today. I think we made the very wise choice of making it its own episode. So that's coming out very soon. Take a look out for that. There will be many good reviews to review. So stick out for that.
And in 2 weeks, we continue our buddy read.
That's right.
With the Hero of Ages, the
That's
final
right.
book
Thank
of the
you, Dylan.
first trilogy of Mistborn.
That's right. If you're reading along, be sure to get cracking on book 3 because in 2 weeks' time, we're going to be talking about it. So you don't want to miss that. This epic trilogy comes to an end. And we're going to be there.
Isn't there something you want to tell them now, Charles?
There certainly is. Thank you for listening, everybody. Go forth and conquer, friends. Is there something you want to say?
Nailed it.